The front of the dojo glowed like a showroom, all glass and mirrors and pulsing red lights. Inside, students moved like synchronized machines' uniforms, spotless shoes lined up in color-coded rows, and phones already recording. The walls held trophies under spotlights. Bold slogans screamed discipline and dominance, and not one person looked uncertain of their place. She stepped through the front door with no sound, as if the building had let her in without asking. Her clothes were plain, a white GI faded from years of washing soft at the collar sleeves a little long. Her hair hung damp from the rain outside, tied back with a simple black band. No one turned. The receptionist waved a clipboard in her direction without glancing up from her phone. A cluster of students near the mirror wall didn't move aside, forcing her to slide past with barely enough space to breathe. One boy tilted his head, nudged his friend, and muttered something under his breath, just loud enough to be heard. Another smirked and shook his head. They didn't laugh hard. They didn't need to. The message was clear. She signed the waiver slowly, her handwriting tight and even. She handed it back without a word. Then she turned toward the mat and bowed. No one returned it. Her feet moved without sound across the polished floor. She stood out not because she tried to. She stood out because she didn't. No logo, no gear bag, no energy drink tucked into a branded bottle. She had nothing to prove, and that made people uncomfortable. The drills started. She was placed somewhere in the middle behind the regulars, close enough to follow, but not enough to be seen. Her movements were clean but small. The students beside her threw their kicks high, loud, and wide. Hers stayed tight, controlled quiet. The man leading the class didn't speak to her. He didn't correct her or ask questions. His GI was black, trimmed in red, name stitched across his chest in gold thread. Everyone knew his name. He had nothing to say to someone who came in late and unnoticed. Someone near the mirrors whispered loud enough for it to travel. They said she walked in like she owned the place. The phrase caught on. A girl across the room raised an eyebrow and called her the Ice Queen. The others smiled like it was already an inside joke. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. She just kept moving like none of them existed. No one asked where she came from. No one cared what she was here for. But in that moment, something shifted. The dojo didn't know it yet. But the story they'd be telling for years had just begun. Section 1, introducing Riley, the woman with no name. She moved like someone used to being invisible. Not hunched, not ashamed, just practiced. Her steps were quiet, measured, like she had learned a long time ago that noise invited attention, and attention rarely came without judgment. The GI she wore was old but clean. The collar had softened with time and the hem curled slightly at the ends. There were no patches, no school logo, no embroidered rank. Her hair was still damp strands clinging gently to the side of her neck. She had tied it back with a plain elastic band, not for looks, just to keep it out of her way. A few droplets from the drizzle outside had followed her in falling from her shoulders and catching the light against the dojo's polished floor. She had no gym bag, no branded hoodie. Her hands hung at her sides. Fingers relaxed, the knuckles thickened in the way that only years of repetition can shape. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed the faint marks along her wrists, or the way the skin on her forearms bore the memory of wraps and tape long removed. But no one looked closely. The students nearby were louder than needed, calling out strikes like they were playing to a crowd. Their uniforms were newer, brighter, stitched with names and tiny flags. Their movements chased power but missed stillness. Riley never tried to match them. She simply observed. When her turn came, she moved with the same quiet she carried when she walked in. A few glanced at her, curious at first, but she didn't smile, didn't fidget, and their interest faded. What they didn't see was the way she scanned the room between drills, not watching the students, watching the structure, watching the rhythm. Every detail seemed to register with her. Where the mirrors stopped, how long the rounds lasted, where the instructors stood between sets. She wasn't learning the routine. She was reading the space. Earlier that day, she had stood under the awning of a coffee shop across the street, watching the glass walls of the dojo flicker with red light. She stayed there in the rain for almost 10 minutes, unmoving. Her hands were tucked into the sleeves of her jacket, the same one now folded in the cubby by the locker room. She wasn't afraid. just patient. Back home in the dim light of her kitchen, she had refolded her gi one last time before tucking it into a simple nylon tote, the kind you get for free at a clinic. She had stared at it for a long while before zipping it shut. No name tag, no belt wrapped around it, just cloth and memory. She had not trained publicly in years, not since the injury, not since she had tried to come back once and found herself turned away for not fitting the brand. But none of that showed on her face now. She didn't walk like someone chasing a second chance. She walked like someone who had already made peace with something most people never even knew they lost. Her silence wasn't emptiness. It was weight, like stone beneath water. Someone nearby bumped her arm too hard during warm-ups. They didn't say sorry. She didn't say anything either. She just adjusted her stance and gave them space, not because she was timid, but because she knew where she stood and where they didn't. Every motion she made was deliberate. She didn't throw extra punches. She didn't stretch her kicks to show off. Her energy didn't rise or fall. It held steady like a pulse. There were moments barely noticeable when she would glance at the mirror, but never at her reflection. Her eyes landed past it, like she was looking through something. Or maybe someone. No one asked her name. The instructor didn't introduce her. She wasn't assigned a buddy. She was just another trial guest, another unknown. But the room didn't know what they were looking at. They saw someone quiet, unbranded, late to the game. What they missed was the way her breathing stayed even when everyone else was panting. What they missed was the edge in her balance, the discipline behind her stillness. She didn't come to prove anything. She came to see something for herself. And though no one there could feel it yet, something in the room had already shifted. Not loud, not sudden, just enough to ripple under the surface. She had walked into a dojo filled with voices that shouted and feet that slammed, and yet the one thing that would echo the longest had entered without a sound. Section 2. The Cold Soak, her first test. 2.1. The Setup, Mockery in Motion. When the instructor called for partner drills, most students paired up instantly, clapping hands, laughing like it was all part of a show. Riley stood at the edge of the mat, waiting. No one moved toward her. The silence around her stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. Then a tall red belt with too much confidence stepped forward. His name was Brody, and he walked like every mirror had once confirmed he mattered. He tightened his belt with a smirk and pointed 2 fingers at her like he was picking someone from a lineup. She didn't respond, just nodded and took her place across from him on the mat. His GI was spotless, lined with bright red trim, hair-styled skin still glistening from warm-ups. He leaned in and said something too low for the instructor to hear, but loud enough for those around them to catch. People laughed. She didn't blink. As they bowed, he tossed a lazy wink in her direction, already turning before she could finish her movement. Then, without any pause, he dropped into a wide stance and swept her front leg. It was fast, clean, and sharp. She hit the mat flat. No chance to counter. The dojo erupted in laughter. Phones were already out. One student whooped and spun in place like it was a halftime show. Brody held his hands up like he'd just won a tournament, flexing his biceps toward the mirror wall. Someone shouted out a mock play-by-play. She sat up slowly, brushing hair from her eyes, and stood without help. She didn't glare, didn't argue, just reset her feet. He was still grinning when the instructor raised a hand. Chad's voice cut through the noise, deep and smooth, like someone who was used to commanding attention. He said it was time for a demonstration of accountability. Everyone knew what that meant. 2 students walked over to the far wall and pulled back a folding screen. Behind it sat a tall, glass-walled tank filled with water and floating cubes of ice. A blue glow lit the base and fog curled off the top. Someone had etched the words, "Cold Soak Discipline," onto the back wall in all caps. The crowd shifted toward it, buzzing with excitement. Phones went up again. Brody motioned toward the tank with a dramatic bow, adding a line about ladies first. She didn't look at him, just stepped forward, her GI still damp from sweat. Voices whispered behind raised hands. Someone joked about thumbnails and TikTok titles. A girl pressed record and said this one was going straight to the reel. Riley stepped up onto the ledge and eased herself into the tank without a word. Her hands rested at her sides. Her breath never caught. She didn't shiver. She didn't speak. The room waited for a reaction that didn't come. The laughter didn't stop. Not yet. But something about the way she settled into that freezing water made it feel like maybe it would. 2.2. The ice bath. 6 minutes of silence. She lowered herself into the freezing water like she'd done it before. No flinch, no hesitation. Her hands disappeared beneath the surface and the cold rolled across her skin without acknowledgement. The glass walls caught every angle. The ice shifted slowly around her arms. Vapor rose in lazy swirls drifting up toward the red ceiling lights. A girl near the back clicked record and whispered that this was perfect for the thumbnail. At 1 minute the taunting began. Someone shouted at her to smile. Another asked if her heart had frozen yet. Brody laughed loudest, calling her a statue with no soul. Riley didn't move. Her eyes stared straight ahead, unblinking. At 2 minutes someone knocked on the glass like she was an exhibit. A voice joked that maybe they should call for medics. Brody leaned in and shouted that she looked half dead. She blinked once, slow and steady. By 3 minutes the noise began to thin. A few students looked at each other unsure. Someone lowered their phone without realizing. The instructor crossed his arms and stayed quiet. Riley remained still. The water reached her collarbone. Her breathing never sped up. Her shoulders didn't tense. She sat in that freezing tank like it was a waiting room and nothing more. The only movement came from the fog rolling off the surface and slipping down the glass. At 4 minutes the laughter had nearly vanished. Someone whispered that this wasn't normal. Another girl backed away from the tank, suddenly unsure what they were part of. The tension had shifted. It wasn't funny anymore. By the 5th minute the room was nearly silent. Even the buzzing lights overhead seemed quieter. Riley hadn't changed position once. Her silence wasn't performance. It was presence. At 6, the instructor finally raised a hand, said that was enough. Riley stood up from the tank, slowly water sliding down her GI in sheets. A towel was handed to her, but no one met her eyes. As she walked past them, dripping and calm, phones stayed up. But no one was smiling now. No one clapped. Her silence had made more noise than any of their shouting. And none of them could explain why. Section 3. The locker room and her past. 3.1. The mockery continues. The locker room lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow across the tiled floor. Riley stepped inside her GI, clinging to her body, soaked and heavy water trailing behind her in thin lines. She moved toward the bench without looking up. Across the room, voices broke the silence before it could settle. A girl near the lockers called out in a sing-song voice something about royalty needing a throne. Another one laughed and dropped a wet towel at Riley's feet. It landed with a heavy slap against the tile. They called her Ice Queen again, louder this time, like they wanted the name to stick. One girl mock-bowed and mumbled a line about her reign being cold and silent. The others laughed too loud, like they were performing for each other more than for her. Riley didn't respond. She sat on the edge of the bench and began untying her belt fingers, slow and deliberate. The fabric was worn and slightly frayed at the edges. She smoothed it with her hands before folding it in half. They kept talking. Jokes stacked on top of one another, echoing off the tiled walls. Someone mentioned frostbite. Someone else said she hadn't blinked once since walking in. No one seemed to notice that the laughter felt thinner now, less certain. Riley placed her belt across her lap and started folding her GI. She did it with care, smoothing each line before tucking the sleeves in and folding once, then again. The cloth still dripped onto the bench, but she didn't rush. Behind her, the conversation turned from mocking to strategy. One girl wondered if Riley would even show up again. Another opened the group chat and posted a blurry screenshot from the ice bath. They were already editing it into a reel. Riley's hands stayed steady. Her breathing never changed. She tucked the folded GI into her tote and zipped it shut, then sat still for a moment, hands resting in her lap. The buzz of the lights grew louder as the voices began to fade. No one noticed when she stood. No one looked at her face. She walked to the far corner to finish dressing. The girls returned to their own reflections, checking hair, adjusting gear, trying to recapture a sense of control. But something in the room had shifted, not in volume, but in weight. Riley hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't defended herself. And yet the air felt different now. They had tried to push her. She hadn't moved. 3.2. The truth folded in a ziploc. The room had gone quiet. The laughter had moved on to the hallway, replaced by the low hum of the lights and the slow drip of water from Riley's hair. She sat alone now at the far end of the bench, her bag on the floor beside her. She unzipped the side pocket, fingers moving with practiced ease. From inside, she pulled out her phone, cracked at the corner, the screen still glowing. She opened her voicemail and tapped play. Her brother's voice came through soft and steady. He said he was checking in, asked if it was the same kind of place as before. Told her she didn't owe them anything. Said she'd already proven it all and he just wanted her to come home if it wasn't worth it. There was a pause before he said he loved her. Then nothing but the soft click of the message ending. She didn't replay it, just let the phone sit on the bench beside her screen, dimming to black. Her hand moved back to the bag, searching deeper this time. From the bottom, she pulled out a Ziploc bag, edges yellowed plastic, cloudy with age. Inside were newspaper clippings folded too many times. She opened the seal and slid one out carefully. The headline was bold and loud. A teenage girl with a split lip, hand raised high, stood frozen in the grainy photo. Riley Hale. Her full name printed beneath a story that once meant everything. The paper creased right through her last name, a line that had formed from years of being folded and carried. She smoothed it with her hand, but the crease held. Another clipping showed her with a medal, smiling without makeup, hair pulled back in the same knot she wore now. She had been a name once. State champion. Tournament favorite. She had fought clean, fast, and quiet. But a spinal injury changed the course. Doctors warned her. She tried to come back anyway. What followed were months of recovery, then stillness, then silence. She had stopped competing, stopped coaching. Even the last time she spoke at a clinic for underfunded schools, they asked her to wear lipstick and talk about confidence. She never got invited back. She didn't argue. 2 years ago, she applied to this very dojo to be an instructor, sent in footage, testimonials, years of experience. They thanked her for applying but said she didn't fit the image. She read that line twice, then closed the email. She never replied. Now here she was, sitting under fluorescent lights, no belt around her waist, nothing to prove. And yet she was here. She slid the clippings back into the Ziploc, pressed the air out, and sealed it shut. Her hand brushed the bottom of the bag where her old belt lay coiled. She left it there. Some things didn't need to be worn to matter. Not today, not yet, but soon. Section 4. The Challenge. Beginner Belt Blitz. 4.1. The rigged game begins. The next class started louder than the last. Music echoed off the mirror's trap beats, pounding through hidden speakers. Instructors high-fived students on the way in, and someone yelled that tonight would be fun. Chad stood in the center of the mat with a grin already forming. His black gi looked freshly pressed, the gold lettering across his chest catching the overhead lights. He clapped once and waited for silence. He called it the Beginner Belt Blitz. The rules were simple, or at least they sounded that way. If a white belt could land one clean strike on him, they'd move up the board. If they missed the clip, went to the dojo's social feed. Phones came out before the first name was called. Students lined the mat's edge like it was a game show. Some were nervous. Some were just hoping to go viral. Everyone knew the drill. Chad didn't lose. That wasn't part of the script. One by one, students stepped forward. A young boy threw a jab and got swept before he could blink. The crowd laughed. A teenage girl tried a spinning kick and missed by a mile. Chad ducked, spun, and winked at the mirror as if performing for an audience. Even the instructors didn't stop him. No one corrected his stance or questioned the purpose. The game wasn't about improvement. It was about performance. And humiliation was part of the act. Riley stood at the far end of the mat. She hadn't moved. Her arms hung loose at her sides. She didn't stretch or pace. She watched. She wasn't on the board. No name was called for her, but she stayed in line, quiet, unnoticed. The others had mostly forgotten she was even there. A girl with braces threw a wild punch and stumbled. Chad stepped back easily, barely shifting his weight. He looked to the phones and mimed, yawning. Laughter rippled again. Another student bowed out before trying. The energy in the room fed on itself. Every miss earned a snarky comment. Every clip got saved for later. There was nothing real about it, just staged failure disguised as tradition. Riley's eyes didn't follow the students. They followed Chad. She studied how his feet settled between counters, how his hands lowered when he mocked, how his rhythm changed when he turned to the crowd. She wasn't scanning for an opening. She was tracking patterns, breathing, weight. By the time the last student missed and bowed off the mat, Chad turned to the line again full of swagger. Then he pointed toward her. The Ice Queen, that's what they called her now. She stepped forward without a word. The room didn't quiet. It got louder. Voices rose, phones raised. Someone bet she wouldn't even touch him. No one expected what was coming. Not even him. 4.2. 3 kicks that shook the room. Riley stepped to the center of the mat, feet bare, GI still damp at the hem. She didn't look left or right. Her eyes were fixed on Chad. The room leaned in. Phones raised. Voices buzzed with anticipation. Someone called out Ice Queen like it was a punchline. Another said $10 said she wouldn't touch him. Chad smiled like it was already over. He took a casual stance, arms, loose shoulders, open weight light on his heels. He didn't bounce like in the warm-up. He didn't need to. Or so he thought. Riley's toes touched the line. She didn't nod. Didn't blink. Just shifted slightly forward, her balance folding into itself like breath held in the chest. Her knees bent. Her spine lengthened. Then she moved. The first kick rose fast, a clean front strike that caught Chad square in the ribs. The contact was sharp, precise, with none of the flash the dojo had trained into its students. It didn't knock him down. It didn't need to. The noise in the room cut off like a switch had flipped. Chad stumbled back, hand to his side. The grin fell off his face. Someone near the mirror whispered, "Wait." Phones dipped. A few students lowered their arms without realizing. Riley didn't pause. The second kick came off her pivot foot, a roundhouse clean across his upper arm. It wasn't wild. It wasn't overpowered. It was placed with intention. His body turned with the impact balance tipping. He staggered 2 steps to catch himself. No one laughed. Chad squared his stance again, but his hands were up now. His posture had changed. Defensive. Uneasy. He muttered something that didn't land. His rhythm was broken. Riley moved again. The third strike rose from the floor like a tide. Her heel turned through the air with coiled precision, a spinning kick that landed clean in the center of his chest. It drove through the contact body, rotating timing tight as wire. Chad lifted off the mat. His back hit the glass display at the rear of the dojo. Trophies shattered. The frame cracked. A metal plaque clattered to the ground beside him. He crumpled where he landed, eyes wide, breath knocked from his chest. The room didn't move. One phone slipped from someone's grip and hit the mat with a dull sound. A girl near the corner dropped her jaw but said nothing. The LED lights buzzed faintly above the broken case. Riley lowered her leg. She didn't smile. Didn't breathe hard. Her hands relaxed at her sides. She bowed toward the center of the mat. No one returned it. Then she turned, walked to the edge. Her pace never changed. Students stepped out of her path without thinking. Brody stood frozen near the back phone, still in handscreen dark. His mouth hung slightly open as if waiting for something that never came. No words, no celebration, just the sound of her steps. She pushed open the door and stepped into the night. The room never recovered. Section 5. The Reveal. The name behind the silence. 5.1. The dust settles. Chad stayed on the floor, one hand pressed to his ribs, the other braced behind him as if the mat might shift. Shards of broken glass from the trophy case scattered around him, catching light in sharp reflections. The sound of the impact still lingered in the room, even though it had already passed. No one spoke. A few students glanced at each other, eyes wide, faces pale, unsure if they were supposed to react or pretend it hadn't happened. One instructor stepped forward, then stopped, caught in the weight of the silence. Phones slowly lowered. Screens turned black. Fingers hovered above record buttons, then retreated. The energy that had filled the space just minutes before had collapsed in on itself. Every grin had vanished. Riley was gone. The door still rocked gently in its frame from where she had walked out. She hadn't looked back. She hadn't waited for applause. The silence she left behind didn't invite anything. It just settled in like dust after a collapse. A student near the back reached down to help Chad sit up, but he waved them off, jaw clenched, breath shallow. He looked stunned more than hurt. As if the pain hadn't registered yet, only the fact that he'd been seen losing control. Nobody asked if he was okay. Not out of cruelty, but because no one knew how to bridge the gap between what had just happened and the world they thought they lived in before it. Everything felt exposed. Someone bent to pick up a fallen trophy base split neatly down the middle. They set it gently on the edge of the mat, unsure what else to do with it. The mat had never felt so wide, or so quiet. At the front desk, a junior instructor lifted the waiver clipboard. The sheet was still there, signed in sharp, slanted print. Only the first name had been visible when she handed it in. But now, through the pressure of the carbon copy, a last name bled faintly through from an older fold. The instructor blinked at the name. Hale. His voice barely registered as he said it aloud. Across the room, another student was already searching it on their phone. No one cheered. No one posted anything right away. The room had nothing left to give, just broken pieces, and the kind of silence that forces people to sit with what they missed, what they mocked, what they couldn't undo. 5.2. The search begins. Someone finally said her name out loud. The junior instructor at the desk held up the clipboard, eyes fixed on the faint lettering that had pressed through the page. Hale. It wasn't a name anyone in the room had connected to her. One of the older students pulled out their phone and typed it in. Riley Hale. The search results loaded faster than expected. Articles, brackets, highlight reels, tournament photos from a decade ago. A few tapped the first video, and the sound of an old crowd cheering filled the silence. The clip showed a younger Riley guy, bright white eyes, focused stance, sharp and still. She moved across the mat with quiet confidence, no wasted motion. Each strike landed clean. Every breath was measured. She didn't speak in the video either. More students gathered around the screen. Someone mirrored it to the big monitor on the wall. The dojo filled with the echo of her past. Thuds of contact, the referees count the crowd exploding at the final point. She bowed at the end, just like she had tonight. They watched her dismantle opponent after opponent, her face never shifting, her movement precise and deliberate. It looked nothing like the showy routines practiced here. No grunts, no high fives, no mirror checks between rounds. Another instructor remembered. She had applied 2 years ago, sent in her resume, her footage, her recommendations. But someone on the staff had said she didn't fit the image. Too quiet, too plain, not the type of instructor that drew crowds on social media. No one said it aloud. They didn't need to. One of the black belts bent to pick up the broken trophy again. He held it for a second, then set it carefully beside his belt on the edge of the mat. It felt like a small gesture, but it landed heavy. Someone in the corner muttered that they had no idea. Another said she never even told them. No one asked why she had come back, or why she chose to stay quiet. The answer was already clear. She didn't come to prove anything. She came to see if the place had changed. It hadn't. So she reminded them what it should have been. Phones lit again, but not to post. Just to look. Headlines called her a teenage phenom, an underdog turned champion, then a quiet exit after injury, a decade of silence now broken without a single word. They watched the clips play over and over, but this time no one added filters, no one dubbed music. They just watched, and tried to understand how they'd missed everything. She had been real the whole time, and they were just now catching up. Section 6. The Quiet Return and a New Beginning. 6.1. Outside the System. The cold air outside hit her face like a quiet welcome. Riley walked with steady steps, her duffel slung over one shoulder, the strap frayed near the seam. She didn't look back. Behind her, the dojo lights still glowed red through the glass. Music had stopped. No one followed. Her reflection caught briefly in the door as it swung shut behind her, then vanished. The sidewalk was slick from earlier rain leaves scattered along the curb. Inside, a young girl stood near the front desk, her face pressed to the window, breath fogging the glass in small bursts. She couldn't have been more than 12. Her belt hung low, tied twice around her waist to keep it from dragging. She didn't say a word, just watched Riley pass under the streetlight. Riley didn't wave, didn't smile. She looked up once, caught the girl's eyes, and gave a small nod, the kind that said everything without saying anything. The girl nodded back. By the time the front doors locked for the night, the first clips had already started to circulate. They didn't come from the dojo's official account, just shaky phone footage reposted through group chats and private feeds. Most of them ended the same way, with Chad hitting the wall, with glass on the floor, with Riley walking away. The dojo never issued a statement. No mention in newsletters, no highlight reel. They acted like it hadn't happened. But some students didn't return the next week. A few instructors stopped showing up. Others taught with less volume, less edge. Something unspoken had settled into the place. The trophy case was replaced with a blank wall, just black mats and a rack of plain belts. No spotlight, no etched slogans. The mirrors stayed, but more often now students looked past their own reflections. Riley didn't post. She didn't comment or tag or share. Her name trended for a day, then faded beneath the noise of newer clips and louder voices. But the video stayed. It kept resurfacing in quiet corners, shared between people who didn't want entertainment, who wanted truth. She didn't return to the dojo. She had never meant to. That place wasn't for her, not anymore. In the mornings, she walked through her neighborhood with no rush, stopped for coffee in the same small shop, sat by the window with her hands wrapped around the cup. No one recognized her. She didn't mind. Some nights she rolled out a mat in the back room of her house. No camera, no lights, just silence and memory. She moved through old forms, bodies slower now but more grounded, not chasing speed, just staying present. People talked about her like a mystery, a ghost from the past, a lesson no one forgot. But she didn't carry the weight of that. She had let it go the moment she stepped outside. She didn't break the system. She just didn't belong to it. And she didn't need it to know who she was. 6.2. The mat is ready. The garage door creaked open just after sunrise. Pale light spilled across the floor, catching on a folded stack of mats in the corner. Riley stepped inside, barefoot, sleeves rolled to her elbows, tape in one hand, her breath still visible in the cold air. The space was small but clean. No mirrors, no banners, no sound system. Just concrete walls, a water jug on a crate, and a narrow shelf holding 2 folded towels and a speaker no one had used yet. She unrolled the mats one by one, pressing out the creases with her palms. Her movements were slow, steady. Each step was placed with quiet care, like the floor itself had been waiting for her. There were no trophies on display, no posters of past wins or slogans in bold lettering. Only a single belt hanging by the door aged and darkened the fabric, soft from time and sweat. It hung from a nail without fanfare. She taped the final edge of the mat, smoothing the corner down with the side of her hand. Then she stood back and looked at the space. It didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be real. The morning was still quiet outside. A few birds called from a nearby tree. The hum of early traffic drifted through the open frame of the garage. She sat on the edge of the mat, stretching one leg then the other, rolling her neck, breathing into the cold. A few minutes passed before the knock came. It wasn't loud. Just a soft tap against the side wall, followed by the sound of small feet stepping onto the threshold. Riley turned and saw her. The girl from the dojo stood in the doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder, sneakers held in one hand. Her white belt was already tied, trailing near her knees. She didn't say much, just looked around the space, then looked up at Riley. "Are you teaching?" Riley paused for half a second, then smiled, not wide, just enough to be seen. "I do now." The girl stepped onto the mat, quiet as a breath. Riley made space for her to sit, then reached for the second towel on the crate. She handed it over without explanation. The girl nodded once and began taking off her shoes. There was no sign-in sheet, no rank chart, no expectation of what came next. Just 2 people in a room built for movement and focus, the kind of room where no one needed to prove anything. Riley stood and looked at the space again. It was enough. Here nothing had to be said twice. Respect wasn't earned through spectacle. It lived in how they moved, how they showed up. The mat was ready, and so was she. Strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it enters the room quietly, endures what others wouldn't, and leaves only after the truth is clear. Riley never asked to be seen, but in the end, she showed them what real power looks like. The belt she wore wasn't about rank. It was about return. If this story stayed with you, take a moment. Reflect on those who lead with silence, who fight with presence, and who rise without needing permission. Share it, if you know someone who carries quiet strength. Because sometimes the ones we overlook are the ones we should have followed all along.